Bingo. And now we will play our ratchety clickety clickety light bulbs and clickety clacks things. And one of these days we're going to have music for all of this. Opening thing, which has got this retro vibe from my steampunky science fiction novel there. And tortugan.wordpress.com, my words site. And if you don't have that on your PC or your smartphone, what the hell is wrong with you? Get a grip on this. Now, we're going to have a little bit of a surprise before we get into the main act here. Here is a shot from 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is the 50th anniversary of 2001. And because of the serendipitous nature of that, I decided to kind of go with it. And because I discovered something literally yesterday that I had never noticed of 50 years practically, we're watching 2001. It was this shot here I put on the space station scene. And for all of you who are not old farts, who didn't see 2001 when it came out, it is impossible for anybody in my generation that saw 2001 to ever hear the Blue Danube without seeing orbiting space stations. We can't do it. We can never see people in hoop skirts. It's just impossible. Well, this one shot here, this is in the space station, and you can just see the little itty bitty Pan Am space cruiser, like there's a Pan Am in 2001, that's going to theoretically dock, and they didn't actually film that shot. But anyway, this thing is a pullback. And you had these little bits here where they had these optical inserts that showed people standing this way, and then over here they're upside down, and then something or other is going on here and here. Well, literally, I never bothered to look what these things showed. And fortunately, because I had the high definition Blu-ray, I was able to come in closer. And for the first time in all of these years, actually noticed this one is a little itty bitty set that they built for the movie. It's not used anywhere else. And then obviously they redressed it and had different actors for the version up here because they're standing upside down. It was these that surprised me. In all the years I have watched this, I never bothered to notice what these were. This one is the hard one to figure out. But over here, if you see it in high definition, you can't probably see it if you go. I put the link into this clip, by the way, so anybody can go look at this. But if you have a high definition version, it's painfully obvious what these are. These are side inserts, clips from the Discovery, the ship that goes out to Jupiter. There's the floor. There's the guy sitting down there eating the food. The astronaut comes walking in. This is an outtake from later on in the movie that was used to fill in the little inserts for these little sections. And I never noticed this before in all of the years that I'd watched the movie. So I will stop sharing that little geek out moment for 2001 and go back to the exciting world of what we're supposedly talking about here, which is apes and the Neanderthals and the continuing analysis of the stupid creationist book by Christopher Buba and company. Christopher Rupe and John Sanford, Contested Bones, which was sent to me as a gift to the impoverished writer to analyze because he didn't feel like going through it. He said, would I take it on? And I go, yeah, absolutely, because this is a way of showing the whole methodology of how source methods is applied to anything you deal with. So 2001 kind of connects up with this in a peculiar way because 2001, the plot, for those of you who haven't seen it, who've lived in a cave, it's about alien intervention that have altered the ancestors, primate ancestors of human beings and taught them how to brain each other with bones. And that eventually leads to us in the 20th century and 21st century having atomic bombs and being a nuisance. And then the Star Child is a bunch of stuff later on. So it's basically a plot about alien interventions making us. And the idea that maybe violence is the thing that helped make us us. And that was an idea that was kind of knocking around in paleoanthropology circles back in the 60s. It's not very good today. We have a much better understanding about human evolution and all the rest, which brings us up to 2017 and our creationists who have their own version of alien intervention. An imaginary friend in the sky made human beings about 6,000 years ago. And everything that has happened has come about since then. And all of these not quite humans in the fossil record are what? And the point that finally finishing up the Neanderthal chapter is that they're just people. They are just as sophisticated as we are. They're identical to us. We have some of their genes. They're just unusual looking people with kind of big brow ridges and no chins. The Neanderthals, as I pointed out in earlier episodes, are not close enough to us anatomically and genetically to be classified as the same species. We are close enough that we can still interbreed occasionally, and theoretically in future they're going to be able to figure out exactly what there have only maybe 100 breeding episodes probably in the history of the human Neanderthal and the interaction that produced the haplotypes that we have today. And whether or not it was men with the women of humans or the human males going with Neanderthal females, or both, depending on circumstances. Theoretically, they could figure some of that out by looking more closely at the mitochondrial DNA and seeing whether or not what kind of admixtures might have popped in there. But now that they've got enough Neanderthal examples, we got our friend Eatmail here as an unwilling victim for my chit chats back and forth, because I do like to have kind of the interaction for things. As much as I love hearing myself talk all the time, there's also the fact that I like to have a little bit of interaction on stuff. So what I put into the linkages for everybody that wants to play around with it, not only the 2001 link, and also I let's get this off my head before I go on back on the Neanderthals, is I'm a big film music buff, and I happen to know that 2001 had a different piece of music to it in its original version, or at least the planned version. Alex North, who had worked on Spartacus with Kubrick in the 1960 period, was hired to do the music for 2001. And by this time, Kubrick really was getting off the idea of using specially composed music. He was becoming obsessed with using already existing classical music and popular music in his films, and basically did that for the rest of his career. And Kubrick had written, North had written about 45 minutes of music for 2001, from the dawn of man all the way out to when they land on the moon and are about to go out to the monolith, and actually go out to the monolith. And Kubrick had a big showing of the rough cut of the so far. And North was there as one of the people involved in it, and he sits down and watches the movie, and none of his music is in it. It's still the temp track music. And that's how he found out that he wasn't going to have his music used. And Kubrick never actually bothered to tell him. It's one of the most notorious examples of stiffing an artist. And so Jerry Goldsmith, who was a great lover and admirer of North's art, after North had died, he got the rights and made a recording of the music so everyone could hear it. And then I did, as my own little fuss potty thing, I constructed, years gone by, and unfortunately I could never upgrade it because I didn't have the skills for it, but I used VHS and beta tapes and recording stuff on manually and over the tapes and played them simultaneously. I created a temp version of 2001 to see what the movie looked like with North's music put back in, and holy moly is it different. It was just like a completely different universe, and it was obvious that North had a much different cut of the movie on the space flight sequences from what you had in the finished cut that was using the Blue Danube, because I had to literally cut the sequences down to fit them. So anyway, that's, I put a little note up there. If there's anybody who's a techno geek that wants to help me construct a performing version of North's 2001 so that everybody can see it, and maybe put it up on YouTube if they can get the rights to it or something like that. I don't know what circumstances would be, but there are a couple instances. There's a thing where somebody put up a posting, and I got a link to it, of the opening credit music with the North music put back in. And I don't say it would have been a better movie, but it certainly would be a different one, and we should do a whole show on that sometime, but this is not it. So I hope you not mind my slight digression here on 2001. Anyway, so the main topic then is Neanderthals and their artistry, what kind of brains they had, whether they had language. All of these are things we can't tell because there are no Neanderthals around to look at directly. So we got to look at everything secondarily. And the creationist model is that all Neanderthals had to be humans. And so what is going on in their argument is scavenging around for the little bliplets that can allow them to fit together with that, and overlooking data right and left. Because presumably Rupe and definitely Sanford are young Earth creationists. They've got an axe to grind. Apparently one of the later chapters, I've deliberately not tried to look ahead in the book to see, anticipating what's going on, but they do have a section on radiometric dating, so it's clear they are going to try to slip their young Earth creationism in way down the road after they've set the stage with all of this deck stacking stuff. But their problem is they're tripping over the data field. And so one of the articles up there, which relates, I think the label paper in PNAS, has to do with the Neanderthal cave and the animals that are found in it. And because you can read this stuff for yourself, you can see what information that they didn't bother to mention about the animals that are present in this cave. They're extinct life forms, and they're unusual forms that are make sense in terms of the standard geochronology, because this is, you know, tens of thousands of years ago. But how does this fit to the flood? Was this flood deposit? So it's going to be fun to see whether Sanford ever had the gumption to actually go ahead and integrate all this information in their own model, even though all of this information is technically under their belt. I also put in a little piece to the creationist Marvin Lubenow. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He's referred to obliquely as a researcher on human origins. He's a creationist whackaloon. And he is obsessed, of course, with trying to dispose of human evolution material. And this is now the second citation that the authors had used of this Lubenow. He's so far the only creationist that they've alluded to in there. The reference they got was from a version that was in a book that came out in 2016, but it's pretty obvious that they were actually, that was presumably based on an earlier article, a two-part article that Lubenow had given. So I put the links up to that so anybody can follow on. And you'll be able to see an awful lot of the apologetics that the young Earth creationists do, because Lubenow basically distills it all. And I'm certain some of the material that Rupe got, he nicked from this material from Lubenow. Because they have quite a lot of the same source tracking is going on in there. So we'll say hi to everybody, Brian and Doc and Bina. I think you popped up in some of the shows in that before. Hello, all the gang. First guy. Hi-oh, everybody. Hi, gang. This is an interesting area because with Neanderthals, their book is eventually going to go off, jumping back all the way to Australopithecines, and then they're going to do a thing on Homo habilis, and then the branching into humans. And so there's going to be an awful lot of more data for them to overlook in future chapters. But the Neanderthal one is a fascinating one because for every little bit of cherry picking they do about how talented and wonderful the Neanderthals were, there's also data they're overlooking. And the current view would be, based on the information that we can have, that Neanderthals had independently developed a very interesting, complex culture that didn't quite make it. And there's some indication that their trading networks were way smaller than humans, so they were communicating less effectively over long distances, and their diet may have been a little bit different. They were certainly stressed in terms of slipping through the Ice Age era, because their habitat was right in the realm of all of that glaciation, as opposed to humans that were hunkered down in Africa, where they had a little bit more comfortable environment. And of course, you had the Homo erectus that had spread out earlier. And one of the big debates, I've alluded to this a little bit before, but I'll reinforce it, is one of the big debates that just embroiled paleoanthropology 30 years ago was out of Africa versus multi-regionalism. And Wolpoff, who's still knocking around today, it was one of the main advocates, and still is, of multi-regionalism, which is the idea that the human species developed in little pockets, and Neanderthals were an example of this, and that they developed, and there was gene flow a little bit back and forth, but basically there were these regional differences. Whereas the Out of Africa gang is saying, no, from what we can see from the genetics, humans all have DNA that trace back to this African base core group, and then they went pulses that went out and then replaced the existing populations without virtually no interbreeding. Well, it turns out both of them were right and both of them were wrong, that there were, in fact, a bunch of pulses going on and much more variety and interbreeding going on than zero, but not quite as simplistic a set of pockets as what was being thought of in the multi-regional model, which is usually the case in things where people are just starting to look at a data field and they're trying to make the best sense out of it that they can. And then after a while, it dawns on them that it's more interesting than either one of the versions had. So that's my little opening intro on there. Any reactions from our Eat Meal?
No.
Am I just inundating you? with all this stuff in there. Well, a question that I asked Jackson, and I'll ask you as well, because this is a useful feedback thing. When you were growing up, what did you know about human evolution and Neanderthals and the kinds of things? What issues or not? What was popping into your head, and did it change over time? Get us a little personal thing from your feedback point of view.
Uh, well, my early schooling wasn't the greatest, so like for well, we always pronounced it Neanderthal. So is it
Mhm.
Neanderthal or Neanderthal?
It's actually pronounced Neanderthal because the Germans pronounce the th as a t sound, and it's spelled often with just tal because that's the French version. But the Germans have a th in there. So if you have the word, if a word was spelled thinge, which would look like thing in English, it would be tinge in German. And so a lot of the letters are pronounced very differently. So yeah, it's Neanderthal, even though it's spelled with the damn th because those damn Germans put extra letters in.
Well, no, so early on though, we were basically told that early man, like early caveman, was Neanderthal. So like we, as a child, I always thought that Neanderthal was an early human ancestor. But obviously, as it grew up and people like Aaron
Yeah,
Raw
and
came
that was the
along.
same way I grew up with, even back earlier in the 50s and 60s. That it was kind of like that was the precursor. And in films, they always would have Neanderthal as the brutish bit, and there was this ladder of progress myth that you start out with the brutish ape, and then you end up as the sophisticated human being, which was always a white European for some reason, and everything else was kind of in between. And a lot of racism kicked into a lot of this stuff. This view was definitely reinforced in the 1920s and in motion picture representations of it. So everybody talked about that. The revolution that our creationists are picking off of was the fact that it was finding that the Neanderthals were more sophisticated and different than what we were used to. And they had a long haul. I mean, they were around for about 500,000 years, which technically speaking is longer than our species has been by a wide shot. And they went through an awful lot of ups and downs on things. They did some amazing tool work. We now know that of course, we knew they had clothing. They did some fishing. They knew how to do. They were fascinated. One of the articles that you'll see in the linkages relates to their use of ochre, and the idea then that human beings and Neanderthals too had a thing about using paints and painting stuff. And you can't help but suspect that this is stuff that's got a symbolic meaning to them. And you can't ask them to find out what. But in the same way, when cultures today still have body painting, they are carrying a lot of cultural baggage with it. The one big uncertainty that just drives paleoanthropologists nuts is how much language was involved. And I'm one of those that really thinks that language roots go way back before the Neanderthal split that produces our species, and then theirs is a side branch. That language is developing way earlier, and it relates to tool making, among other things. And that you have the interesting then question is, at what point does explaining to the kid how best to pick a rock and where you need to go whack in order to chop off the blade the best way, where does that leave off, and when does storytelling begin? To where what's that big light up in the sky, and why is there wind, and why did Grandpa die? All of that stuff. When they start making stories, then you have the whole roots for the cultural nexus that religion will eventually come out of, as well as in its own side branch, science. So the neat thing about the advantage of a lot of the technical papers today is you get caught up, and you have to unlearn some of the conceptions that you had younger. And so probably one of the best toolkits you can have is not saying everything you know is a lie, but always being able to have a sense about how much of what you may currently know is based upon stuff that you learned in school, which was based upon the textbooks that were based upon the science research that had been done 40 years earlier, and that got filtered through what the textbook commissions thought about. So all of that would act as a filtering area. And I could say that the vast majority of things that I understand about human evolution aren't things I ever read or learned about in high school, or for that matter, even in college level. Because that college level stuff that I was dealing with in the 1970s, that stuff is superseded by information today. And boy, if you had gone in a time machine and said, oh, by the way, in the 21st century, we will have DNA genomes from the Neanderthals, and we'll be able to tell which genes we have are produced, and some of our immune system problems come about because we boinked with the Neanderthals, and you know, they would be flabbergasted by all of that. But when I was growing up, so much of the details of what genes did weren't known yet. The detail level, homeobox genes weren't discovered until the 1990s. So, so many of the little structural things and the things that are the result of all these complex papers and trying to figure out how all the little fiddly bits are working is a really neat aspect of things. One interesting bit has to do with the amount of stuff that's been done. They've been finding juvenile Neanderthals so they can tell stuff about growth patterns. And we now know that the growth systems in the tooth patterns and things in Neanderthals aren't human. They're sufficiently diverged from our regulatory cascades that the way of their growth pattern is not the same that we find in humans. And that's another reinforcer of the fact, no, they're not just us without a chin. It's revealing that that information isn't in the Sanford book, even though it's from 2017 and theoretically could have known about it. I'll continue to say hi to the people over there. You can also, Eat can also keep an eye on what's going on in the side chat there to see if anything pops up in terms of good questions. Yeah, Freighter Chaos says, see, science keeps changing, so it must be fake. Yeah, that's a very common trope. I'm sure anybody who's bumped into creationists in the wild will find that example. It says, well, you keep changing, but changing in what way? If you were to look at a textbook and look at what they were making sense of stuff in the 1970s that related to technical literature, they would have the general picture still pretty accurate, that you had these Australopithecines in Africa that are the root group, and then you see human beings spreading all over the Eurasia with this Homo erectus bunch that then start diversifying into more separate groups, and the Neanderthals are popping along, and that picture still is accurate. We just have more blips on the scope, Homo rudolfensis and Homo heidelbergensis and all these others that are the almosts that are showing up, so that we can start seeing finer point details today than we did before. And as the old cliche goes, the more fossils you have, the more gaps you have to fill. So if there's more forced blips on the screen today than we had before, plus we have more of the genetic data and all the rest. And yes, Psystrike says, yes, and the Bible is the unchanging truth from the Bronze Age. Yeah, and so for people who are very uncomfortable with uncertainty, they're uncomfortable with question marks. They want the answer. They want the exclamation mark, and it doesn't matter if it's true or false. If it makes them feel good and explains things in air quotes, they're happy with it. And it's always going to be a thing that you have to kind of combat in order to say, no, reality is what it is. And the trick is to figure out what it is. And to do that, you need more data. And the idea that every new paper that comes along, one of the things that pisses me off royally are the amount of public news blurbs on the latest discovery that blows the lid off of the sun. No, it doesn't. That a lot of these things are really overhyped. And they're things that produce interesting new wrinkles in things and change some of our perspectives on stuff, but they don't cause all the old data to go away. And that's one of the things that creationists are able to exploit, is that they can riff off of these headline approach to things, and they don't look at the underlying details, which is why the source methods approach is so useful, because that's where you want to look at, is the primary source data. Don't bother about what the Science Digest thing or somebody says secondarily. That's only a doorway. You want to finally get a sense about what the original material is. And not all of you will be interested in paleoanthropology. Some of you will have different areas. I'm more of a dinosaur guy myself. But there will probably be something in astronomy and geology, in almost any area, history. There's going to be something that your interest in it at the primary source level will be useful in dealing with anti-evolutionists, particularly creationists, because they've basically shred everything. that all the world, all of the if you've studied Catalhuliac, that site in Turkey. It goes back like 9,000 BC. It's one of the first examples of kind of fixed religious shrine things, bull symbols and stuff. Apparently had a bull worshipping cult in there. And then this is in the time when they're starting to do megalithic construction. That history has to be shredded in the flood model, in the creationist thing, where everything is all the God of Abraham and the Garden of Eden, and then things sprinkle out until we get all of this vague stuff going on with the Tower of Babel and, you know, the flood and all that stuff. They've got to get rid of everybody, because how are they going to deal with these places that are in the neighbors? What is going on in Americas? Domestication of completely different food crops, different language systems that have evolved over, huge branching from whatever proto-language existed before Indo-European developed, maybe 10,000 years ago or so. Yeah, we had just had a popularity contest. Yes, just a idiot says, I just watched a documentary about that freighter, Zeus and the Amazons and Atlanteans chased this big bad alien away from invading Earth, but he came back in 2017. Oh, I missed that in the news bulletins there. Isn't that wonderful? It's always fun to watch the shows that are on History Channel, those idiot ancient astronaut things, historical pornography, I like to call it, and the Nibiru and all of these weird things that pop up in that frame, especially if they have to figure out the data field. And the same methodology that would be used to demolish creationists, you would be using to deal with the ancient astronaut gang. There's an awful lot of parasitical secondary citation. They're relying on a relatively small core of acolytes who are the fact claimants, and they miss most of the data stream on that. So we've got a data field that exists independent of the pundit, and it's the job of the informed critic to know about that and know which anvils to drop and gates to think. Yeah, I'll point out that somebody says you must make a video and tell the world there are no hedges on flat Earth. Yeah, the flat earthers, there should be a hierarchy of dumb to remember, and it could be something that, as entrancing as flat earthers are, they're really trivial. They are virtually irrelevant to everything. They're not in political office. They're not governors. They're not in state representatives. They're not secretary of this and that anywhere, as far as I can tell. But there is a spectrum. Flat earthers are usually, but not entirely, a subset of geocentrism, which contends that the Earth is the center of the universe, as the Bible said. These are usually biblical creationists. And that bunch, unlike the flat earthers, actually affects stuff. Tom Willis, who wrote the Kansas Anti-Evolution Standards that almost made it in 1999, is not convinced that the Earth revolves around the sun. And Elmendorf, I think his name is, it was a Roman Catholic geocentrist who was the guy behind the equal time creationism laws in the 1980s. He was the main drafter of that. So geocentrists, although they play a side role in creationism, actually have had an effect on things and almost got to the legislation and actual textbook level and school standards level. That's something that should make your eyebrows go up, in a way that the weird flat earthers like Jaron and Dubé and others, who may be insufferable and wacky, and you may want to hit your head with a ball peen hammer when you listen to them, but they're not relevant to anything. Now, the geocentrists are a subset of young Earth creationism. That's a much bigger setup. Now you're talking about millions of people, and they actually impact stuff, because some of these are governors. Mike Huckabee is a young Earth creationist, ex-governor of Arkansas. You've got our current vice president, who, if he's not a full-blown young Earth creationist, he's awful close to one. And you've got some that hover around the intelligent design movement, which is the creationism light end of the field. But anti-evolutionism in general, if you use that as the litmus test, not the shape of the Earth, that field covers a huge swath of people, all the way from intelligent design out to geocentrism. And so if you want to use evolution as a litmus test, it's a perfect Jim Dandy one. And you can weed out people who need Tortucan alerts pretty damn fast if you ask them about that. Those of you who follow me will notice that I often haunt Dinesh D'Souza and Ann Coulter and occasionally Alex Jones. He's so whack-a-loon that, boy, it's just hard to deal with it. But what it is I often will poke at them and see who responds. Usually it's not, well, it's never Ann Coulter. Once in a while, Dinesh D'Souza has poked in on the screen. But what it is some of their supporters will pop in and defend the honor, the besmirched honor. And it'll be on some political topic typically. But what I really want to know is what the next question is. Oh gosh, Trump supporters tend to be creationists and climate change denialists. What are your positions on evolution and climate change? That's what I actually want to know. And I'm giving the blurb away. Anybody can find out my secret plot here, which is to determine just what exactly are the belief systems of that. And we know that our gang that circulate around Dinesh D'Souza don't ever bother to fact check him, and they don't bother to ask about these things. And Dinesh never did. He was just at a convention of I think the Phil Robertson guy, the Duck Dynasty guy, was having a big coffee klatch of evangelicals, and Dinesh went down there to preen about the politics and all of that. And when he was announcing he was going to go down, and says, I asked him, could you ask how many of them have raised their hand as to how many of them think the Earth is 6,000 years old? And he never got back on that one, and I can guarantee you that's not a question he bothered to ask them. But it would have been interesting to put a show of hands, because Dinesh is not a young Earth creationist, as far as I can tell. He doesn't like creationism. He thinks it's stupid for obvious reasons, but he can't connect that up with the demographics of the people he deals with. Let me look over in here on I gotta read this one. Tickle me, Bilu. Nice, Mr. Sidestrike. Must now spend 7 years making video to tell a world about water using carburetor that gets 300 miles per gallon, the big oil hide from Public in the 60s. Yeah.
Hey, RJ.
That's actually yeah, jump in.
Obviously, address Bilu first. He's the more important one of the two of us. But I actually had a question about the because you deal a lot with creationists, both young and old, young Earth and old Earth. How do you think that somebody like Dinesh D'Souza, who's an old Earth creationist, how do you think that he deals with the cognitive dissonance while he's having to associate with young Earth creationists, like biblical literalists?
Oh, it's real easy. He's a Tartucan, so he literally doesn't think about things he doesn't think about. And I have no doubt that in the venues that they bump into one another, these subjects don't come up. There's no one getting in there to say, oh, by the way, I think that the Earth is billions of years old. No, these don't arise. In the same way, intelligent designers will schmooze with young Earth creationists all the time, and they just don't connect up the dots. I know in the intelligent design case, it's really diagnostic. When I realize something that never occurs, I mean never, in intelligent design apologetic, which is that map of time, here's what we think happened, apply the chronology, put the data into the chronology field. Steve Meyer is a perfect example of this. He's an old Earth creationist for all practical purposes. He knows the Earth is billions of years old. The Cambrian is 500 million years ago. And yet, he wrote an article on the Cambrian with 3 co-authors, 2 of whom are young Earth creationists, Marcus Ross and Paul Nelson. And so for half of the writers in his co-authoring think the Cambrian occurred during the flood 4,500 years ago. And yet there's no dot connecting there to try to figure out, well, let's work out a consensus position about what we think happened with anomalocarids in the Cambrian. As to whether or not they're occurring at the same time the pyramids are being constructed, or whether or not they're 500 million years ago. That isn't coming up. And it's exceedingly easy. The venues that Dinesh would be running into creationists would be like Tony Perkins's Value Voter Summit thing. Tony Perkins is a young Earth creationist, but they're not lecturing on evolution there. They're talking about politics, and let's get rid of gay marriage, and let's not worry about transgender people in the military and all of their hot button issues. And he'll be talking about the politics and the culture camp. He won't be talking about geochronology. So it's real easy for them not to think about this. And even when prodded, they'll go into deer in the headlight mode and not think about it. Because to do it, if they had to ever try to put all of that data onto the field, their brains would just go bling, and they would have to deal with all of that cognitive dissonance thing. This map of time issue that I've pointed out, I'll reprise for the boring part. There are 4 main areas where anti-evolutionists and virtually all people who believe things that are not true screw up. I'll do the Vulcan thingy here too. Number 1 is they have their main demographic is addicted to secondary sources that they don't fact check. And in the case of anti-evolution, it's 95% out of some 2,000 people that I've tracked so far. They're the 5% who do, 2/3 of them don't even actually read the sources themselves. They're just copying them secondarily from somebody else. Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man, guys like that, David Klinghoffer at the Intelligent Design Movement, that's all in that bunch. So you actually end up with a teeny tiny little core of only about 50 people who are the actual fact claimants. And then you can now measure, I'm measuring, that's another reason why I like to keep at my work, nobody else has ever done this, damn it, is to actually do source by source by source to track down all the primary source citations. One of the things that kept me really busy this week was looking up this article that this creationist lobbed at me on the genetics and the chromosome fusion, I think it was. And it had a whole bunch of technical citations in it that I needed to plug into the system. But overall, anti-evolutionists are only bumping into about 85% of my data field. And my data field is like 23,000 sources and counting. And my thing is a floor. My data field is not the whole data field. It's what I bumped into. And their 3,000 some odd sources is a ceiling, because a lot of their stuff is secondary citation and a lot of it is dated material and so forth. So as a rough heuristic, it's a fair measure to say that anti-evolutionists are missing 90% of the data field. Well, boy, if you've got that kind of a mind that can avoid data that easily, that just simply, it's like a fog bank. Oh, they don't pay any attention to it. So all they have is the little teeny poster card cartoon version that they repeat to one another. Even if evolution were to come up in a discussion, none of them are going to be talking about the details. They're going to just mention the talking point tropes. And Dinesh, I think, would be, when you look at the few examples, he's popped up only a couple times on the evolution scope. One was in his book, What's So Great About Christianity, or Why Christianity is So Great, something like that. The same book that he was telling us that the Inquisition wasn't really so bad. And I'm not making this up, essentially was complaining about evolution because Daniel Dennett and that bunch were trying to figure out the evolution of religion. And that's stepping on his little philosophy turf. Ooh, mustn't have Darwinism accounting for why people believe in gods or not, even though it's looking that way. And other than that, he wasn't terribly comfortable even with intelligent design. He'd been slightly critical of it, but it's not the case of where he's talking about sauropod vertebrae or any detail material. It's just kind of a disquiet, because there is something from that kind of dweeby collegiate environment that Dinesh floats around in, that's the kinds of stuff that's the Chamber of Commerce meeting at the Ramada Inn sort of cultural frame, or the college lecture hall thing, including Ivy League colleges. That kind of demographic is not something where you think much about evolution. And so he's very easy to get away from it. Now, he bumps into climate change a little more directly. Not because he's ever read any of the technical literature on it, but because it's an ideological point. And so I've even found among his own supporters that there are occasional people who are okay with evolution, but they will be climate change skeptics. So these would be the kind of economic conservative, boy, those nasty leftists and their agenda to make everybody drive clean cars and get rid of all of our nice coal plants. That has a political cachet to it that's outside the clear boundaries of anti-evolutionism. So is that kind of a clearer? Boy, I digressed a bit on this, didn't I?
Well, I think you did a really good job of kind of, at least for Dinesh D'Souza, singling out exactly what drives him, and you nailed it. It's politics. Everything about him is politics. I've never seen him pick a thing when he does like a controversial college campus tour. I've never seen him pick something that wasn't currently being talked about. Like he's trying to constantly push that.
And his own stuff, which I have no complaints about. I mean, I push my books, he gets to push his. Let me just jump in briefly with our little my plug for our and you're on this, I believe. There we go. And my patrons. We're a little bit past half hour. I normally like to do that sort of in the middle of the show, and it always takes me a bit to do the stupid sharing because I'm an incompetent clown. It's troublesome for them. My various tip patrons here: Stephen and Dyer and Eat, and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody, Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex Stone. Totis Real, I love saying that. Everett and Paul, thank you all. And here's the website again, which is a repeat. That way I like to reinforce: tortukin.wordpress.com, tortukin.wordpress.com. And the Patreon thing, which is slow as molasses, as I have to point out. And so for people who actually want to help me rather faster, there's the GoFundMe.com DCGo, and there is the delightful sharing, and I can now close that little file off. So there's that. So the politics angle is impossible to ignore. It would be nice to think that there's this rarefied world of science over here, and then there's this politics over here, and you don't really need to think about all these other issues. But it's actually, when you look at it from a methods direction, you can see commonality of structure. There is not a dime's worth of difference cognitively between Dinesh D'Souza and Mark Dubé, the flat earther. They have a different set of content, but they both have parasitical minds that cherry pick information to fit a preconceived doctrine. They don't really think through what they think happened, and they don't have anything in their head that allows them to change their mind. And in that respect, them and Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and fill in the blank, Robert Kennedy Jr., the anti-vaxxer, when we did the show with SciStrike on one of the movie nights back a couple of weeks ago, where they were looking at one of these anti-vaxxer videos. Unlike flat earthers that aren't affecting anything, anti-vaxxers are actually potentially worrying about kids' lives. And this can actually have a practical effect on people that may end up dead as a result of it if you follow the wrong science here. So this methods issue actually comes back to bite. And it also means when you're looking at someone like a Robert Kennedy Jr. versus a Dinesh D'Souza, they're as opposite spectrum politically. They wouldn't be caught dead in the same ballpark. But methodologically, they're twins separated at birth. And so trying to look at how you construct arguments, what information you pay attention to, how open are you to changing your mind on things, how much are you really evidence-based, and you need to pay attention to as much of the evidence as possible. So there's the peer review system, there's checking up on those pesky little footnotes and references that I literally had several of Dinesh's supporters independently tell me that they thought Dinesh's books were well documented because they had lots of footnotes. No, they just have lots of footnotes. And unless you check their sources, you don't know whether those are good footnotes or bad footnotes. And since I've checked quite a lot of his footnotes, I know that Dinesh suffers from cranial blockage of the rectum when it comes to source analysis. He's capable of jumping off the gangplank, citing stuff that doesn't exist at all, but he got it from a secondary source, they got it from another secondary source. And other cases where if he did cite the primary source, he can't read. The Inquisition case and the Papineau and Johnson on eugenics thing, which I've done a little video on with Jackson a ways back. So this method stuff comes back and bites. And it's come into high gear in the Trump administration. There were occasional pseudoscience gets knocking around in previous years, and you found a bunch of them in a little more than the usual incidents in the Reagan administration. But yet, by comparison to today, they were a model of sound methodology. You know, you had one James Watt and then a bunch of other people who were not quite so wacky. But here, you've got a veritable train wreck of people who are showing up as sloppy methods people, and they're in charge of stuff, and they're writing regulations or deregulating. They're making things that are going to be affecting people's lives for quite a while at a time when you need the best decisions possible. So from the political hobby horse matter, As an old Reagan voter here, I'm in kind of an odd position because I've gotten weird looks from PZ Myers, when I said that, and and some of my secular groups, I got Bernie Sanders supporters in there, and they literally gasped when I said, "Oh, I voted for Reagan," and I'll explain why if you want. And for that same reason that I voted for Reagan, I voted for Obama, and I didn't vote for Donald Trump. He scares me methodologically. And so we can't avoid these issues now. Climate change in particular is one that's on the hot burner as to policies that would need to be done or not. The Defense Department has got to be paying attention to this stuff because the water is already lapping at the facilities there at Hamptons Roads that we need to deal with. The migrations of peoples because of things, the changes in dynamics. We already know that the droughts in California are directly exacerbated by climate change. The cycling of droughts there is not natural. It's not what you expect from the normal cycle that occurs over various things with the El Niños and La Niñas. No, there's an overlay on that that's much more severe and intense, where your high temperatures are coinciding with drought things in ways that is not usual. And you have, in some cases, thousands of years of climate record to be able to check this with. So we got a whole new world in there. Noah Diffenbaugh, it's in my bibliography. He's got quite a few papers. He did a wonderful lecture here at Gonzaga just around Earth Day. And he said that if you believe in thermometers, you got to believe in climate change and global warming. That was his take-home point. And I was live tweeting for the first time from the show on that, and it was very useful. And he was talking about his upcoming technical paper that pops up in I think Science Advances or one of those. Anyway, it's in the bibliography. Look under Diffenbaugh. I'll put his name up in the live chat here. Boop boop. Noah Diffenbaugh. Boop, boop. The idiot says that's quite charitable, James Down. It would be a methodology problem if they gave a crap that what's no, they do in their own weird little way. This is one of the things that I get into big knockdown dragouts with some of the people in the skeptical community on, who are insisting that upper level creationists are frauds. That Ken Ham or Kent Hovind actually know what they're saying is claptrap, and they're just doing it for the money and to serve their religious agenda. And I don't think that. No, I think they believe everything they say. And when you understand how the Tortucan mind works in your flat earther case, and then moving into the geocentrics, and then into the young earth creationists and old earth creationists and intelligent designers, and then anti-vaxxers and ancient astronaut groupies and 9/11 conspiracy theorists and moon landing hoaxers and Holocaust deniers. I mean, there's no shortage of woo that you can look at. You all see the same dynamic of the methodology of how they go about doing this. Somebody like Philip Johnson and Richard Milton and Michael Denton. I will ask you metaphorically to raise your hand in the audience if you recognize any of those names. Philip Johnson is the avatar of the intelligent design movement. He's still around, although he had a stroke some years back, and so he's not as active as he was before. But he kind of got the religion bug, and then he got on the anti-evolution bandwagon and basically jump-started the intelligent design movement in the late 1980s. He's regarded as the guy who pulled all of the gang together. Steve Meyer and all the others that are now in the Discovery Institute got there as a result of the activism of Philip Johnson as a catalyst. He got into Harvard when he was 16. He's a bright lawyer, accomplished in his own field from Berkeley, more politically conservative than the people around him, and then he got on the intelligent design bandwagon. Well, from a methods point of view, he relies on secondary sources he doesn't fact check. He doesn't really think through what he thinks happens. He lacks curiosity. We know he reads young earth creationist stuff more than he does technical literature. He would riff off of a John Woodmarat paper at Answers in Genesis and actively recommend it to David Berlinski. And yet I've never spotted any indication in any of his writing that he pores through the Journal of Paleontology or any of the technical journals, Acta Paleontologica Polonica, or something like that for light reading. So there is a narrowing of the data set, rigid ideology, failure to work through what he thinks happened. I pointed an example of when I was asking him about the reptile-mammal transition. What would he accept as evidence for evolution? And you could see his Tortucan mind veering. Ooh, that's a bad question. No, you're falling into an evolution trap to ask about what evidence would change my mind. And so all of these same traits are showing up, even at people that are very, very bright and accomplished. And you would think education would have prevented all that. Now we can remove one other variable, religion, with Milton and Michael Denton. Richard Milton is a British brilliant guy, editor of British Mensa magazine, and he's functionally a young Earth creationist. What? How is that even possible? And it's a rarity. He's such a rarity that he's not really cited much by much of anybody. About the only people who do occasionally cite him are young Earth creationists. Mike Riddle has, and the Tim LaHaye guy, Left Behind ideology, that novelist that connects you up with Kirk Cameron and Ray Comfort, that nexus in that direction. But those are about the only people that seem to pay any attention to Milton. But Milton is my poster child for scholarly incompetence. He siphons stuff secondarily, and he thinks it's as if he read them himself, and he'll copy arguments, never bothers to cross-check material, never fact-checks material. And so there's the same trait over and over again with that. Michael Denton is the other one. Denton is apparently an agnostic and one of the big gurus in the intelligent design effort. He's kind of at the top of their food chain. And for those who have Evolution Slam Dunk, I think you have a copy of that, don't you?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to talk about how good it is, scientifically, because like I've said, I'm a moron. But I can tell you, when you hit a guy with that book, they stay down.
Yeah, well, as you know, I went into Denton in great detail. And it was one of the last things that I was working on the book, because his book literally came out just shortly before my book. So I was in the process of working on my book when I discovered, Michael Denton has just come out with a revision of Evolution: A Theory in Crisis. I got to look at it. And so I literally talked the NCSE gang to buy the book for their library. They sent it to me so I could look at its contents, and then after I was through, I shipped it to them. So I didn't get to keep it. I was a loaner, and it went in because they weren't planning on even getting it. But I made the most of it, because Denton is an agnostic, so therefore the religion angle isn't relevant. He's no religious angles to grind. But you could see in his repeated cases how his mind just doesn't follow up on his own sources, how he doesn't think through what he thinks happened, how he doesn't investigate stuff, literally stuff under his nose. He just doesn't connect up on it. And with somebody that's as bright and as accomplished theoretically as he is, it's a pattern of behavior that really stands out. That map of time element and that change your mind thing are things that are literally 100% failure rates in the anti-evolution movement. Nothing could have prevented somebody in the anti-evolution movement to think through what they think happened. Flood geology people theoretically could be just obsessive. In the old tip book that you can find online, I would offer examples of people like Michael Dummett, who's the playing card expert. He's actually a lawyer and philosopher, and that's his main area of interest in his actual career, but he's just a playing card groupie. And he collects them, and he's a history of playing cards and all that. And he's written the classic book on the history of tarot cards, The Game of Tarot. And he covers everything you could possibly want to know about all of it, in terms of all the different games and all the different. And that's what happens. The same thing with sports gurus and groupies or opera nuts, that they will know you ask Jay Leno about carburetors in a 1957 Chevy, and he will tell you about that, because you become totally immersed and obsessed with every scrap of information that you can get. That's what people who love their fields do. And what you find is there's this hole in their argument, that what would be preventing them from figuring all of this stuff out? If they believe the flood happened, fine. You would want to explain why your neighborhood looks the way it does. You would want to, if you were on a lecture tour, you would be wanting to explain why the neighborhood that you're seeing underneath the hall is from a flood deposit. You would be applying your model everywhere, and you would be happy to do so, because it reinforces what you want to be true, and it brings all of this new data in and makes your argument stronger. And yet you don't get that. Why? Because the data is never going to fit, and they don't have curiosity to even look. So they're just walking in and they deliver their show, and they may have put up a slide about the Grand Canyon or Mount St. Helens or the Lewis Overthrust, and they'll, or if they're an intelligent design thing, they bring out the rote routine. Casey Luskin bringing up the Cambrian explosion and all of that in his PowerPoint, and he forgot to, in the lecture that I saw him at, he never even had the decency or care to tailor his lecture to the venue. He had like a 20-minute thing to talk, and he was trotting out this hour-and-a-half long PowerPoint. And so he's suddenly realizing he's running out of time, and so he has to jump ahead to try to skip all of that in. Minds that will do that can easily overlook data. They do it, it just bounces off the Tortucan mind shell. And it doesn't depend on religion. It doesn't depend on politics. I would contend that really serious ideologues and dictators and nutballs need to be Tortucans in order to be able to fulfill that for their brain to function. They have to have a good gift of gab, and they have to have a good rhetorical style and all of that. They tend to be personable, although you can occasionally find prickly ones. But by and large, successful ones have a certain charisma in that to them. But it doesn't matter about content. So that's why I think the anti-evolution case is really a useful litmus test here, because it forces us to think about the thing that we can't imagine other people thinking about. That there are minds that literally don't think about things they don't think about. Those of us who are insatiably curious about stuff and that lack a Tortucan rut in a particular boundary layer, you can find Tortucans that will be perfectly reasonable and effective people outside of the rut. But within the rut, whoa, suddenly you've got a completely different dynamic going on there. And that's why you can probe this with methods questions. Theoretically, anybody can lob me with a methods question, and I theoretically should be able to respond on where I'm getting my sources from and how I go about checking them and all that. And hopefully people who have been listening to me for any length of time and reading my books and other stuff will know my method by how I apply it. That's another really important take-home lesson to methodology, is you see a method by how it's used, not as some abstraction. When you talk about the people will bring up an example, examples don't exist in a vacuum. You need to be able to generate a generality from it. And conversely, spewing a generality or a general principle is meaningless unless you can give a specific example of it. And that's a feedback loop that works in people who think clearly. It won't be occurring in Tortucans, because they'll be looking at generalities as a generality, and they never bother to think, does it actually apply to anything? Or they may be offering little nitpick gotcha points, and they're not really making inferences from them in terms of larger contexts. You find this, Ann Coulter is extremely prone to that kind of a thing. She'll constantly be calling attention to immigrant rapists and immigrant violence. Oh, they found another immigrant that did a terrible thing to somebody. Well, that's a terrible thing. And how many immigrants are there? And how many illegal immigrants are there out of the millions? What's the percentage rate? Are you more likely to encounter violence in NRA members or in people who are left-handed in Poughkeepsie? It's data selection. And yet she'll tunnel vision in on that kind of stuff. That's the diligent Tortucan ideologue mind at play. And it's the same methodological problem that Mark Dubé would with flat Earth. So is that sound reasonable, or am I too kind in thinking that creationists can't be complete liars?
No. I think you are. Like, what was the guy's name, that old Earth creationist? Hugh Ross.
Oh, Hugh Ross?
Yeah, yeah. Hugh Ross is like an unbelievably smart dude, and I love listening to him. But the moment you start going into religion, I kind of feel like that he's bending over backwards to accommodate these other beliefs, or he just skirts them entirely and says, I don't want to talk about it. And then he goes talking about like astrophysics.
We did a Skype just about a month ago, and you can't see it online because he wouldn't put it online. We talked for an hour, and it's clear that his little apologetic points weren't getting anywhere with me because I know more of the data set than he did. And it just bloop. So I keep on poking at him every once in a while to say, when are you going to put my thing up? You know, he sounded like he wanted to have more conversations with me, but if conversations mean he wants to find something that's going to fit his apologetic frame, and if not, it's not going to see the time of day. No, that's not very fair. But you, Ross, one of the reasons why, if you look at old Earth creationism, it's always had a problem methodologically because it's got to be schizoid in a way that intelligent design doesn't have to be, and young Earth creationism doesn't have to be. Young Earth creationism can flush evolution down the drain and the age of the Earth with the same method. And intelligent designers don't bother about the age of the Earth. They just don't think about it. So they can use the same method that the young Earth creationists use to flush evolution. And they do. If you look at how Casey Luskin approaches a technical issue and how Brian Thomas at ICR does, ditto, on the same issues. Old Earth creationists have a problem because they've got to be methodological naturalists for all the cosmology stuff and geology, and then suddenly flush that down the toilet when they deal with evolution and start saying, no, consensus doesn't matter, and bulk of evidence doesn't matter, and naturalistic inferences don't matter. And that's been a problem. And that's one of the reasons why old Earth creationists are a real minority group. That it's basically you, Ross, and Fazal Rana, and a tiny number of people orbiting them at close. It's like the little black hole, and boop, boop, boop. It's not a lot of people. Whereas intelligent design, oh, yeah, jump in.
No, I'm sorry. You said that you think old Earth creationists are a minority group. You think there's more?
Oh, absolutely. They're way, way peripheral. The vast majority of anti-evolutionists are young Earth creationists, and anti-evolutionist websites and anti-evolutionist publications. Then the small runner-up is intelligent design, which is has a lot of active writers, but in terms of their core fact claimants, there are only about a dozen of them, compared to 3 times as many over in the young Earth creationist side. And they have virtually no, in terms of publications, young Earth creationists still maintain several creationist journals. Creation Science Quarterly still publishes. And of course, you've got Answers in Genesis has got a bunch of different magazines, plus their research journal that's active. And Institute for Creation Research does their publications and books. By contrast, intelligent design has one little piddly little journal, Biocomplexity, and they'll have one little journal and it'll go extinct, and then there'll be another little journal that pops along. They've gone through about 3 of them so far in the history of intelligent design. But Reasons to Believe is old Earth creationism. That's it. And it's basically Fazal Rana doing posts. Ross doesn't even do all that much. So he's the point man, and there's just very, very little apart from that. And in terms of impact, old Earth creationists, young Earth creationists can't stand them because they're not young Earth creationists, and intelligent designers don't need them. So you have very little indication that anybody in the intelligent design movement pays the slightest attention to old Earth creationism. This is just my annoying sweep of having, 8,000 anti-evolution sources in my bibliography. I can see the whole data field here. And so if you listen to them, they think they're very important, but there's relatively few conferences. Intelligent Design holds conferences. They have an international outreach. They just opened up a branch of intelligent design groupies down in Brazil, and we're touting about it. There's no counterpart of that in old Earth creationism. There is a little bit of that in young Earth creationism. They've got a bit of an outreach, but so there's a competition going on, a selection pressure between the collegiate gang at the intelligent design movement and then the not quite collegiate gang, and also demographically much older. An awful lot of the newer gang are showing up in the intelligent design movement, and they're very busy at this. I attended one of their little gatherings over there in Seattle Pacific University, which is a conservative kind of Gonzaga-ish college over on the coast. And they held for quite a few years these seminars open to the public. Good audience, hundreds of people there, a lot of them homeschoolers and faculty and people involved in that area up on the west coast of Washington. And apparently nobody from the skeptics movement was there to monitor any of this stuff. I was there as a little lone wolf out in the audience monitoring stuff. And this is the kind of groundwork laying that they're doing. Now, whether or not that's going to ever be able to outcompete Answers in Genesis at the grassroots, it's hard to say. Because I know, and even beyond Answers in Genesis, I am much more likely in either on Twitter or in real life to bump into somebody that will mention Kent Hovind before they will ever mention Michael Behe. Or you'll never hear them mentioning Hugh Ross. They may draw on Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research. But those will be kind of bouillabaisse or smorgasborder types, you know, draw a bit off of everything. But yeah, that's the measure of things. You've got young Earth creationism as the dominant group, and collegiate style niche market of intelligent design that's doing a lot of outreach, and how effective that's going to be over the long term is hard to say. And then the asterisk, old Earth creationism, irrelevant to all of the apologetics. Is that a shock to you?
Oh yeah, it's a major shock. Because when it, like, once again, my growing up schooling was terrible, but we always heard about the idea of intelligent design when discussing origins and stuff like that. But every religious person I've ever known has always thought that the earth is old, evolution is real, but it was guided by God's hand, things like that. So the idea that is now a minority belief. Like, I always believed that Ken Ham was like this fringe radical, but
he
that's a
started out
really
as one, yeah. Well, another factor to remember is that you're getting the doctrinal positions of the standard churches, that most Christian denominations have no problem with the age of the earth. So they can go cuddly, you Ross, but not that we're really paying attention to you. Or they might have a little tiny linkage to it. But that's not the grassroots. A lot of grassroots creationists are ones that have their own little church or their own little sub-denomination. They're a section of a church. They may be Southern Baptists and go to the conventions there, but they may be a fringe group of conservative Roman Catholics, or they may be a fringe Protestant sect. They may be some little fringe of Pentecostal. And you'll find them percolating up. Look at the role. A good diagnostic here are the Paluxy River tracks. You're familiar with those?
Wait, is that the one
That's
where they found some tracks in stone and they think that that was like humans and dinosaurs? Is that
yeah,
that one?
bingo. Yeah, these are. It's down in Texas, Paluxy River in Texas, and they are. It's a useful litmus test because in the 1970s, it was just wow. Here are human tracks and dinosaurs. This is absolute proof positive of the flood. Blah blah blah. And then Henry Morris Jr., or no, John Morris, the son of Henry Morris, went down there and looked at it closely and realized that no, this is actually just the heel print of a theropod dinosaur, and none of this actually supports the human footprint trail. Not that he thinks that humans didn't coexist with dinosaurs, just this wasn't a case of it. So they've disowned it completely. And oddly, that doesn't filter into any of the apologetics that occurs at the grassroots. Now, if you look at Institute for Creation Research, they do not push the Paluxy River tracks. They've still got some of the postings and stuff, including the early John Morris before he had the recantation. So you can find all of this on their websites. But Answers in Genesis, they kind of skirt past that kind of issue. But move downfield to Kent Hovind land, they're alive and well. He still shows the Baugh tracks. Carl Baugh is another one that pushes these things. And if you look at like the Mount Blanco Museum and the various creationist groups that exist at the grassroots, it's still alive and well. They think, no, absolutely, the Paluxy River tracks are just it. So if you look at that spectrum from church denominations that have no problem with old earth creationism, down to the doctrinal hyper-conservative creationists that are on the websites and write the books and do the main lectures that have the PhDs, then downstream to that to the local groups that conduct the things, and they go out on little field trips or they make little dinosaur museums and the stuff, and there's dozens of those around the country. That little setup, that group is the Kent Hovind branch of creationism. The guy that just got elected to this House of Representatives in Wyoming, who is a young earth creationist, and he's a rich farmer guy, and he bankrolled $1 million for the little Mount Blanco Museum, I think, or one of the other creation, I think it's the one in Billings, to buy a Tyrannosaur skeleton for their museum. So that brand, and that's in that Kent Hovind scale of creationism. That guy's in Congress. You don't find things like that with old earth creationism. Rick Santorum isn't really an old earth creationist. He's a vague, squishy, intelligent designer. And the diagnostic here is that lack of chronology, that they don't think about terms, time frames. There are a lot of people that I bump into at the grassroots when they'll say, I believe in the flood. And I'll say, when was that? And they'll go, I don't know. Did you not think about it? And they go, no, it doesn't seem to bother them. It's just an event that exists in like a never, never land in their head. And that goes back to that map of time thing. So map of time is a diagnostic. The people you would think would be on your side. Another person that falls into the same crack is William Jennings Bryan from the 1920s. William Jennings Bryan is very atypical for modern anti-evolutionists. But back in the 1920s, he was less atypical, which is that he accepted the age of the earth. He was okay with that. He was politically liberal. He was left-wing, progressive, and quit the Wilson administration over their war policy and a bunch of things. But he was anti-evolutionist, pro-prohibition. That was all very part of the culture frame because they wanted to get rid of alcoholism and all the demon rum and all that kind of stuff. But at the trial, in the Scopes trial, when Darrow was cross-examining him again and again and again, and the whole transcript of the trial is available online, so you can read all of this. It's actually much more interesting reading that than the crib version in Inherit the Wind. That when Darrow would try to pin him down on anything outside the Bible chronology, even though he accepted theoretically age of the earth, if they were talking about Adam and Eve and Genesis and the flood and Exodus and whether or not Chinese existed for thousands of years before that and so forth and so on, everything was 6,000-year time frame for him. He still had that functionally young earth creationist modality, even though he's not technically a young earth creationist. But in a way he is, because nothing goes. And Hugh Ross is very vague about what the hell he thinks is going on before 6,000 years ago. He talks vaguely about soulish humans. So he has this weird idea that some of the cave art, by his chronology, made by early humans, wasn't really made by soulish men, that it's Adam and Eve that are the first soulish people. And you're going, what? This is nonsense. And it's an indication of how compartmentalized you can be on a lot of these little fiddly bits. That there are things, basically he was, my perspective on Ross, and there's a lot of creationists from all spectrums that fall into the same thing, is they have things they like as science. He grew up in a thing with astronomy, and he loves astronomy. So that data field he doesn't want to reject, and he can't cram it into a young earth framework, so he's not going to be a young earth creationist. But he actually was asked in a debate, if he thought the Bible taught that the earth was young, what would he do with all this data? And he said he would get rid of it. That the only reason why he can accept that is because he can believe that the scripture doesn't teach a young earth. But if he thought it did, never mind what the data says, out it goes. So in a cognitive sense, he's indistinguishable from Todd Wood, who knows all the data for evolution and says that no, evolution is not a theory in crisis, and Darwin didn't recount on his deathbed and all these other things, and there's actually lots of evidence for evolution. But because he's a doctrinal creationist, he does not allow any of that information to be true. And whether or not the Todd Woods of the world or the Hugh Rosses can ever manage to edge past that and have an epiphany is really hard to say, because it just bounces off the mind shell.
Wasn't this show supposed to be about Neanderthals?
It was to start with, but you know me. And I'll connect the dots then. I'll bring it back because we're past the hour there, so I should probably get pulling this thing to a halt. Is that there's a fascinating puzzle that paleoanthropologists will be tinkering with, which is what was going on inside the heads of Neanderthals. A question that was pointed by Mithen, I think his name is. I forgot what his first name is. He'd written a wonderful analysis of the Neanderthals back in the mid-1990s. It's in my bibliography. Everybody look in my damn bibliography. You can find all this crap. Anyway, the question is, if you were to show a Neanderthal a sculpture of a horse, would they recognize it as a horse or not? that ability to abstract an object. We're not sure. They may or may not have done that, even with symbolic symbols, even with the idea that they may have been using ochre and certain colors might be symbolic of life or death, and who knows what kind of little proto-religions and things they were developing, and whether or not they sang, and whether or not they did rhythms, and what kinds of stuff did they, what kind of vowel sounds. That we know their larynx is slightly different, so they figured that some of the vowel sounds that we could make, they couldn't. So they might have had a more limited repertoire of sounds. But whether or not they would have been able to conceptualize in quite the same way that somebody that did the artwork in Lascaux later on, we don't know. I'm still rooting for the cognitive variety of Neanderthals. I think they were way closer to us cognitively in a variety of ways, but they were just a little different. They had a different cultural frame. One of everything from the fact that their trading networks were smaller to the fact that they had a relatively short life expectancy compared even to their human relatives. The humans figured out how to use atlatls, and the Neanderthals suffered from an enormous number of rodeo injuries. They would be attacking big animals right up front with the damn spears. And so they were getting thrown and broken things all over the case, whereas humans were able to attack from a distance, spear chucking. And so that meant that they could have a little bit better life expectancy and a few things in terms of cultural networks and the like. You know, if they could get back in the time machine, I'm sure that the scientists would be going, oh, of course, duh. Oh, why didn't we think of that? But you're trying to look at all of this stuff from 500,000 years later, to where you're just piecing together the fragments of their remains, their fragments of their burials, whether they were putting flowers in intentionally or not. We know they had to have a certain degree of human decency, because there are many cases of Neanderthals that lived past serious injuries, such like that it's unlikely that they could have fended for themselves if they had to be the hunter. And they are therefore being taken care of in the community. And that's telling you something about their dynamic relationships. Now, if they're not human, because they're on a different branching from us, even though they could interbreed with us, that means that this human level has developed independently in our two species. And that's understandable from an evolutionary point of view. It's a problem for the everything is made by God, Zot, soulish humans. And so in that respect, you, Ross, and our Sanford guy are grinding the same axe. The idea that humans are too special not to be specially made. And both of those people they have totally different geochronologies, but they both require the same thing. And you move over to intelligent design, where they don't care about chronology at all, and they too insist on the same thing. They've got to have everything that's really human-y be human, because we're unique. Whereas I would contend that the only things I've been able to figure out that make us truly unique is something that individually is not unique, but it's the combination that's unique. And I'm saying we are the tool-making species that tell stories. There are probably some other species, probably the complex cetaceans, that tell stories, but they don't make tools. And then there are a bunch of animals, even down to crows, that can make tools, but they don't tell stories. And it's that combination that's made us as insufferable and annoying as we are as a species on the planet today. So there we go. I think that can be a sum up point. You think that works?
I think it works really well. I had one question for my edification, and if you want, I can ask it after the show.
But, oh no, go right ahead. We'll hang on here for a little while longer, and anybody who wants to be bored silly, they can.
Okay, so it's been touched on several times in this hangout, and it's another one of those things that kind of goes against what I learned as a youngin. You've mentioned that human beings and Neanderthal may have like bred. Is that?
Oh yeah. There's no may about it. They did.
So what
we've got about. Yeah, finish the question then. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, what evidence do we have for it? I mean, obviously, other than Mickey Rourke, but what evidence do we have that human beings and Neanderthal?
Oh, the DNA. We now have enough DNA from Neanderthals that we can directly cross compare what the DNA is involved with things, and there are particular haplotype arrangements and the like that we now know that from 2 to 4% of human DNA is Neanderthal, and it's in certain regional areas. That if you are from Nigeria, the odds are that you don't have any Neanderthal DNA in you. If you're from the Caucasus or spots in Siberia or Europe, and I haven't had my DNA tested, but I would suspect I probably have some Neanderthal DNA knocking around it, and virtually all white people do. And so you have a mixture there. And I think there's a little teeny chunk of Oceania where there's a little bit of that popping up in there. So that's telling us about migration patterns and the thing. Apparently the boinking happened in a relatively narrow area. It's when human beings first bumped into Neanderthals directly, which is up in the Middle East, Lebanon, and that area. And this was about 30,000 years ago. And it probably didn't happen a lot. The genetic data suggests that there's maybe been 100 or so interbreeding episodes over the course of thousands of years. So once in a while, a member of one sex either, and that's another interesting question, was it voluntary or not? Was it an example of Me Too being sexually harassed? Or was there a human that was going with a Neanderthal? Boy, that lack of chin really is just hot. We don't know. And it may be that, again, there's a differential elements on that. But yeah, it's now moved past that. And I never thought I would ever see this kind of data field. But the fact that they were able to literally extract DNA, not only from Neanderthal, but early archaic humans. You've got an increasing data field there. We've got the Denisovans that are living in modern day Georgia, in Russia, what used to be Russia. It's now a separate country. Basket case in some cases. But anyway, and there's and then there's yet another mystery group, the question mark bunch. That there's a group of haplotypes that are not found in Denisovans, and they're not found in Neanderthals, and they're knocking around in us, in these archaic humans, but not in modern humans, that suggests that there is a breeding episode involving yet another population. And we'll find out whether or not they can ever isolate any of that. But yeah, anything that's relatively recent, as in like 500,000 years or so, you can pull the full DNA sequences out of that. It hasn't had enough time to decay if it's been well preserved inside, buried down inside of bones or teeth. Teeth is another spot that they can get some of this stuff. They can find an awful lot about diet and other structures in terms of the isotope balances. That's always the thing that just amazes me, that diet produces direct effects in terms of isotopes. The kinds of plant matter has a different isotope ratio than eating meat. And so certain isotopes of oxygen and other calcium, I think, and some of the other ones, you have to check me on it as to which atoms in there. But by seeing the ratios of these in certain contexts can tell you the diet that they had. Plus, when you have burials, you've got the pollen grains, you've got the, if they bury a thing with shells or bones or obsidian, you can tell where the nearest deposits are that would have had that. So you can say, well, they got this little piece of stuff from a rock deposit that's 500 miles away. There's a trading network. And so that you can build up like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, more and more bits and pieces about this ancient people who are otherwise mute. We have we can't investigate them directly, but we can investigate them by their remains. And to my mind, that's absolutely amazing. It's just astonishing. So does that answer a bit?
No, I think I'm going to need you to go into slightly more detail.
I detect sarcasm there, sir.
No, the funny thing is that as I was asking the question, the chat was erupting with DNA. So yeah, I was like the only one
and
here that was not clued
there's
into
a
it.
variety of, if anybody follows Svante Pääbo, which he's got umlauts in his name up the yin yang, and you can find him in my bibliography. Damn it, download my stupid bibliography. There's a wealth of information in there. Don't print it out. It's thousands of pages long. But anyway, Svante Pääbo is one of the people that is involved in a lot of this genetic recovery because he was one of the pioneers of the tools that are used to be able to extract this stuff and make sure that it's no contamination and all that kind of material. And so if you hunt around for the various papers that he's done over the years, you'll find Pablo and his team are involved in a lot of this stuff. If you look up Denisovans and then, of course, Neanderthal DNA, you can Google the things and find the actual technical papers on it. Or you'll probably find an awful lot of really good summary articles in things at Smithsonian, National Geographic, all that kind of stuff. So it all depends on how anal retentive you are as to how deep into the data field you want to dive. But the neat thing is it's available. So anybody can mouse click this material and find out. Some of you may find, if you're a YouTuber type, you can find descriptions of a lot of this stuff on here. Nova did a nice show. They repeatedly cover material on this. And so the various stuff for PBS, there's a lot of stuff, I imagine, that you can see video on that. So there's the, BJ said, have you heard of Svante Pääbo lecture? Hell, next time I think Geo Streber is a masochist for having his hangouts, I'll just remember RJ's bibliography and reading habits. Yeah, I'll just give you, before I shut down here, an idea of what I do in the TIP project. Is I'm spending most of my waking hours, even when I'm jousting on Twitter. If you notice that I may be gone for like a half an hour or an hour before I answer one of these little things, it's because I'm busy doing the work. And that is that I'm mapping in incoming technical literature that's relevant to the subject matters in TIP. I'm also keeping track of anti-evolution literature, some of which I'm encountering because I get stuff freebie from Creationist. I'm on their Discovery Institute Nota Bene thing, so that I get the email, so they're self-identifying their stuff. But I also follow them on Twitter, and so they're putting up material that way. And Creationists will lob things at me. And if I don't have them in my bibliography and they are citing technical literature, it's going in, and I'm going to track down the technical literature. And that sometimes takes a lot of time to locate the primary sources and then to see how it is and do follow-up material if it's older material and try to get a good grip on it. And eventually that's going to be a block that's going to be put into the material in the grand project, if I can keep at all of that, can rattle for the TIP work. And I put a direct link into Slam Dunk so that everybody can actually go out and get that and tell everybody about it. If you haven't reviewed it, do it. And then before I shut down, I'll point out I got a damn novel, and it can attest to the fact that it's a damn good book.
Oh, the
Paralogs and Fog.
Yeah. No, I still love it. It's one of my favorites. I loaned it to a friend of mine who's also a huge fan, and he came back and loved it too. So I mean, yeah, you did
great, great, yeah. That's if you can ask him what kind of favorite scenes or characters or whatever, I'm always anxious to know the feedback to find out what is resonating, because I know foxing was your favorite bit. He may have had a completely different one.
Well, I kind of poisoned the well on that one because I kept using the phrase foxing, so he read the book, and then I knew when he got to that part because he foxed me by pushing me into the pool. So
aha. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm nearing completion on the second novel, and so I will expect you to be amongst the first to acquire it once I get it into publication.
Oh yeah, no doubt. It'll take me another 8 months to read it because I'm incredibly slow when it comes to reading.
Well, I'm a slow reader too. That's one of the reasons it's taking me time to go through all this material, because sometimes the things that you are most important, it takes you a while to see. There are things when I would go through and I would read a thing a second or third time, and I suddenly go, wait a minute. Oh, I was such a dunce not to have spotted that detail. It's the equivalent. Here's a complete arc. It's that the kind of thing that all the times that I had seen 2001 without ever spotting that detail on the docking sequence, there's a thing that it can be right in front of you over and over again, and yet you may not even have bothered to notice it. And suddenly that can become a relevant piece of information. So that's the principle. I'm always learning. I'm very curious about the things I'm curious in, and I'm an arrogant bastard, and so I insist on speaking up and saying if people are idiots. And if they are, then I'm going to not let them off the hook on it. And in times when idiocy can actually make things bad, we all have to stand up and oppose it, because it's not some rarefied thing. If creationists and nutballs were just sitting in their little meetings and having these things and not affecting people. But no, they're making decisions for people. They're going to alter stuff that's actually going to affect people's lives. And that the stakes are too high now. So we got to go on and on. Anyway, thank you, Eve, for showing up. And I like to have the times on this. And I will now be shutting down the broadcast. Thank you for watching this Evolution Hour, which we've gone a half hour over time. But nevertheless, that's all my fault. Au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, aloha.